Awesome. Okay, so we are live, I believe. It looks like everything's a go. I don't know what the proper code is for that, but like 10-4 or something like that. So excited to be here this evening. Really happy and grateful to have you, Royal Gardner and Amber Crooks, join us tonight to talk a little bit about Florida's wetland woes. There's some action happening right now. We wanted to alert folks who follow Florida conservation voters to what's going on and give them some tips on how they can get involved. So to really kind of set the stage, I'm going to be sort of asking y'all a couple questions because you are experts in this area of wetlands protection. But just to kind of set the stage for folks, why are we talking about wetlands today? There's so much going on in the world, in our country, in our state. Why today would we be talking about wetlands? And it's because right now, the state of Florida and the federal government are considering a proposal that could result in a serious slashing of important safeguards to Florida's wetland permitting process. And so the Department of Environmental Protection has placed a request in front of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. It's in play. I'm not going to share more because it's like spoiler alert. That's what you all are going to talk about. But I would love, if you all don't mind, before we kind of get into the questions around this issue, I'd love for you to take a moment and just introduce yourself, who you are, where you work, and what brings you to the world of wetlands. So Royal, you want to kick us off here?
Sure. So I'm Roy Gardner. I'm a professor at Stetson University College of Law, and my principal area of research is wetland law and policy, both domestic and international. I've been involved with wetlands for more than 30 years now, and I got involved in an odd way, working in the Pentagon. So I was in the Army General Counsel's office. I was, my principal client was the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. And that person, who's a presidential appointee, attempts to oversee the Corps of Engineers. So I got involved with wetland issues in the late 80s, early 90s, up in Washington, and then came down to Stetson and Florida in 1994. And Florida is a fantastic place to work with wetland issues.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely have more wetlands than many other places on Earth. So I have, you just inspired a question for me, right? Because when people, I think regular people on the street are thinking about wetlands, they're not necessarily thinking about the Army. Can you sort of elucidate a little bit just on like how do you connect the dots between wetlands and the Army?
Well, there's a bit of a history there, but maybe Amber wants to, we can get Amber introduce herself first before I start, because I can go on for a long time.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a great strategy. Go ahead, Amber.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Amber Crooks. I'm an environmental policy manager with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. We're based out of Naples, but we have a 5-county area so we're an environmental nonprofit organization, and wetland protection is one of our top tier priorities. And so I've been at the Conservancy for about 12 or 13 years now. And this is actually one of my main focus areas, is trying to have development moved out of our most sensitive areas like wetlands, like Florida panther habitat, and redirect that development into more appropriate areas. So of course, wetland permitting is one of the big issues there.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. Well, in Southwest Florida, I mean, of all the places in the state, when I think wetlands, Southwest Florida is definitely one of the first places that pops into my mind.
Yes, basically our Western Everglades. And, I was looking at a map actually the other day of all of the different endangered species consultations that we have here, all the decisions related to endangered species, and Southwest Florida just lights up as opposed to almost anywhere else in the state is Southwest Florida. So we're experiencing a lot of growth. Florida obviously experiencing a lot of growth throughout the state, becoming the third most populous in the union. But we definitely feel it down here in Southwest Florida.
Yeah, you can definitely see it when you visit for sure. Okay, well, so thank you all for introducing yourselves. I love Royal. I'm kind of like dying of curiosity here about the history of the Army getting involved in wetlands.
So it goes back to the 1890s,
Mm-hmm.
and the Corps of Engineers was given a permit program under the Rivers and Harbors Act. And you may be familiar, some of the folks listening may be familiar with Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. And so it has a long, long history. The Corps was given the responsibility to maintain the navigable capacity of the nation's waterways, because at the time, that we're talking about rivers for the most part, the Corps was tasked with keeping them open for navigation purposes and for military purposes. They were our highways back then. So if we jump forward to the 1970s, when Congress is considering the Clean Water Act, partly because the states have not done a very good job. Traditionally, water quality issues were the purview of the states. We have plenty of examples like the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catching fire multiple times. And so the federal government says we have to step in, we have to do something about this. So Clean Water Act passed in 1972, and there's a big piece of the permitting piece goes to EPA. But then when it comes for the issue of the discharge of dredged or fill material, the Corps of Engineers says, hey, we've got this permit program. We can keep doing that. But actually the Senate was a little suspicious about the Corps, not thinking that perhaps that they were environmentally responsible enough. And so there was a compromise that was made. So the Corps was given the Section 404 program to regulate the discharges of dredged or fill material, but the EPA would maintain significant oversight of the Corps' activities.
Interesting. That's really kind of a fascinating history, right? Because our mentality and our approach to rivers and natural systems in general has changed so much since the late 1800s, where it started out as we care about rivers because we got to get from A to B and we need to move our goods and we need to be spry from a military point of view, to the 70s when there's sort of an awakening of like, maybe there's more to these systems. So thanks for sharing that history. That's really fascinating. So there's a compromise. The Corps sort of oversees the federal permitting program. EPA has significant oversight. Can you give us a little bit about, so we're talking about the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And when it comes to that oversight, how does the state come in? How does the State Department of Environmental Protection come into play in this process?
So the Clean Water Act envisions cooperative federalism, a partnership between the federal government and state governments. And so it offers states the ability to participate in a number of different ways. One of the principal facets of the Clean Water Act is it starts out with a prohibition of the discharge of certain pollutants. Specifically, it prohibits the discharge of point source pollutants as opposed to non-point source.
Right.
So point source, if we want to try to keep it simple, think of a point source as a pollutant coming out of the end of a pipe. Non-point source would be diffuse runoff from an agricultural field or an urban area or from a leaky septic tank. The states have primary responsibility for the non-point source discharges of pollutants, for that diffuse runoff from agriculture, say. For the point source, the stuff coming out of the end of a pipe, that requires a federal permit. And so coming out of the end of a pipe, it requires what's called a Section 402 permit, or sometimes an NPDES permit, a NIPDES permit, goes by a number of different names. But that requires a permit from the EPA or a state with an EPA-approved program. And most states, including Florida, have an approved 402 program. It's 44, 45, 46 states have an approved program. In contrast, the 404 program deals with the discharge of dredged or fill material. So it's not what you might think of as a conventional pollutant. It could be sand or clean dirt. You're filling in a water body, which obviously has environmental impacts because you're eliminating the water body.
Right.
And so the Clean Water Act says that the Corps of Engineers reviews permit applications. So it's a Corps permit unless it's a state with an EPA approved program. But there are only 2 states that have assumed the 404 program. Unlike 402, 404, only 2 states have, Michigan and New Jersey.
So let me ask you a question, because, comparing what it takes to be in charge and make sure that what's coming out of the end of pipes is not harmful to the environment seems like a less complicated, less burdensome challenge in some ways than like diffuse sources of pollution. I mean, the very nature of it being diffuse seems like it would add an additional wrinkle to any state trying to tackle that problem.
Oh yes, I mean the non-point source challenge is significant. No matter who's regulating it, it so happens that under our system, it's the state's responsibility, and states actually, I don't think they do a very good job.
Yeah, interesting. Well, so I want to circle back in a little bit to the states, the examples that you gave, but before we kind of get deep in, I'd love, Amber, to hear, why is it even important to have a permitting process that governs wetlands? Why is this important?
Yeah, great question, Aliki. I mean, basically, that's why we're here tonight. Wetlands are, just to start at the very basic level, for those, that may not be starting at that basic level, wetlands are those low-lying areas where, that water collects. And, it's kind of funny we mentioned, what was the Army Corps involved with wetlands way back when, because I was just thinking today that historically, generations before us, these marshes, these swamps, they were kind of viewed as a wasteland. But I think, in any kind of development going in and draining those wet areas were kind of a testament to human technology and advancement. But I think, now today, Everglades restoration being one example, where we're spending billions of dollars to actually restore some of those important wetland areas, because we now know that they're an invaluable resource to us humans, let alone the rare and endangered species that also make their home there. So just sort of going through the list of why wetlands are important, why we need to protect them. First off, the first thing that comes to mind is they really act as nature's kidneys. They're naturally cleansing our waters. So the fewer wetlands that we have on the landscape, the harder it is going to be to control pollution that we've been seeing ruining some of our most special places like Florida Springs or rivers or oceans. And of course, wetlands, they help store rainwater. So in fact, little factoid, they can actually accommodate over 1 million gallons of water per acre.
Wow.
And so that helps us in times of storms or hurricanes. So if we have fewer wetlands on the landscape, it's going to be harder to control floodwaters, and it might start impacting our human settlements, our homes, our neighborhoods. And of course, wetlands can act as a storm surge buffer. They can contribute to recharging our aquifer drinking water supply areas. People recreate in nature and wetlands. The fish and wildlife that have some of their life cycle in wetlands, they obviously contribute to our economy. So that's why, we've got to have all the protections in place that we can to protect these places. And unfortunately, everybody wants a slice of paradise here in Florida. So there ends up being this direct conflict between preserving these places we know are important and this constant and increasing threat of development that's encroaching into our wetland areas. We've already lost about half of our historic wetlands. And so this issue that we're talking about tonight, I think, is going to be a really key thing to get right.
Yeah.
Because if it goes the wrong way, we're going to be faced with continued threats to our waters.
Yeah. Well, and you sort of, when you talk about all of the functions or the services that wetlands provide for us as humans, it seems like those services are actually pretty expensive for us to try to replicate on our own.
Right.
So, I mean, is there an element of wetlands being kind of like an important sort of it's like nature can do these things better than we can sometimes, and it seems like it would be sometimes more cost effective to
Right.
leave wetlands in place and let them do their job. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit, or if you have thoughts on that, like this ecosystem services.
Yes.
We hear that phrase used.
Yes, and there's to that point, there's been economists doing reports that try to put a dollar figure to some of the value that we get from our natural systems, and I'm sure it can be up into the millions and millions and millions of dollars that these ecosystems provide to us.
Right.
So I think that is becoming a new area of study, because sometimes if you can't compel people to action by talking about Florida panther or talking about drinking water, which you would think would be motivational, dollars sometimes can motivate decision makers or motivate folks to put an importance on our environment.
Sure, for sure. It's definitely, one way of valuing things. Well, so right now, the United States Environmental Protection Agency is considering a request by our state Department of Environmental Protection, a request that the state take over or assume responsibility for the 404 program that you were talking about, Royal, just a moment ago. And you noted that, there's only 2 states that have done this. So, Royal, can you talk a little bit about, what does all this mean? How is what we do here in Florida? I mean, what could this change, in terms of those 2 states that have the program? Maybe talk a little bit about how that might inform whether or not it's even a good idea for Florida to take this program on.
Right. Well, there's a reason why states haven't taken this on, and that's because it's expensive. Because when you take this on, you are committing to regulate at the federal standards, that you are going to apply EPA's regulations when you make the permit decisions. This requires staff and expertise, and a number of states don't have that, or they don't want to invest in that, and so they're happy to allow the feds to take the lead on it, and they may pick and choose where they want to supplement. So what happens if a state takes it over? The state's the permitting authority, so the Corps of Engineers is out. At least the Corps is out with respect to most waters. Like everything in Section 404, why one could spend their whole career just dealing with this one section of the Clean Water Act. Right. But in Section 404, for this state assumption, it allows states to assume certain waters of the state. The Corps of Engineers would actually still maintain most of the jurisdiction from the old Rivers and Harbors Act.
Okay.
So there's no assumption under Section 10. So the Corps still gets to play along the coastline or in a traditional navigable water like a river. But otherwise, then the Corps steps back. They're out, and it is the state that is going to be issuing the permit. As a practical matter, what does that mean with respect to other federal laws? It means these other federal laws may not be triggered. So, for example, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. This is a law that says when an agency is taking an action, including an action on whether to grant a permit or deny a permit or grant it with conditions, that the agency has to study the impacts of that decision and look at alternatives. It might do so through an environmental study called an environmental assessment or a larger environmental impact statement. Well, if the state is issuing the permit, NEPA doesn't apply.
Mm-hmm.
It's also an issue with the Endangered Species Act, because when there is a federal permit involved, the federal agency has to consult with either the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries,
Mm-hmm.
basically the endangered species experts, before they make a decision on issuing a permit. So if the Corps of Engineers has a permit application that it is reviewing and it involves an endangered species, they need to go consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries. It's kind of unclear what happens if the state is doing that. There's no requirement on the state to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries.
Gotcha. Well, and so, I mean, Amber, I know you mentioned panther habitat.
Mhm.
So maybe you can speak a little bit to, maybe you can sort of put a finer point on this in terms of what the assumption might mean here in Florida.
Yes, I got a couple of examples and a couple of fears, to share. Speaking from an environmental organization's perspective, it's really important to have as many checks and balances as we can on these. Could be a mine, it could be a development, a residential community, it could be a huge mine that would normally fall under the 404 permitting program. So we're talking, it could be very significant, huge developments in Florida panther habitat and wetlands. And so, of course, we like, local, state, and federal each to have their respective, and sometimes it changes, or from county to county or town to town, what the local purview looks like. But to have each of those levels weighing in on a decision as important as a development in our natural resources. But we have some examples here in Southwest Florida where NEPA, for example, was very important in stopping and stopping some development. This was a few years ago, and the Army Corps had received applications for probably about 10,000 acres of mines. Down here, some folks don't know, we have quite a bit of mining activity for lime rock and sand mining here in Southwest Florida. And the Army Corps rightfully used NEPA to kind of pump the brakes and say, wow, this is a lot of wetland impact, this is a lot of development. This area, if Lee County is a very important drinking water resource for the county, this is Florida panther habitat. There's a lot of preserve area here, and we just don't know what the impact of 10,000 acres of mines that could be 100 feet deep will do to the environment. So we need to take a hard look at all of this before we could even consider permits. So they rightfully use NEPA as a tool to essentially stop those mines from creating an irreversible damage to the Western Everglades. In another area down here in Collier County, the Corps also used the NEPA process to take some additional mines that were proposed from 500 acres of wetland impact down to 60. So they really used this tool, NEPA, for better results. All at the same time, our state, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, had already permitted all of those mines within a few years, most of them actually done in 1 year's time. So, even though the agencies, sometimes neither of them are perfect, but really we've got these great tools at the federal level, like NEPA, like ESA, that we really need to have available in the toolbox to make better decisions. And from what I can see of the Endangered Species Act, I am very scared of how this might go forward, because the state is really trying to essentially do a one-time consultation, one-time decision on the how assumption will affect endangered species. They're kind of hoping to do one and done now, kind of figure out the details later. And so normally for a Florida panther consultation, whenever there's a development in Florida panther habitat, the agency is going to have information like, is this in their primary essential critical habitat? Is this in, a very important corridor area?
Right.
What type of traffic is going to be spilling out into the roads? They're going to have a lot more information than what the way that they're planning to do it at this time. So to Dr. Gardner's point, there's a lot of question about ESA in an assumed program,
Yeah.
not to mention the fact that we'll lose NEPA amongst other laws. So
Well, that's really, I mean, that's a really, so, you know, the story that you shared, or the case study, is DEP, our state agency, essentially gave the green stamp of approval for projects to move forward. And had it not been for that protective layer of the National Environmental Policy Act, with the Corps coming in, we could have gone down a path that we would not be able to reverse. So that's pretty chilling. What, you know, I don't know if I want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I feel compelled to share like one of my favorite aspects of the National Environmental Policy Act, and I'd love to get your
I love this.
thoughts on it.
I love nerding out about environmental laws.
There is a concept in NEPA that I absolutely love, and I wish that we would incorporate it more in a lot of our environmental decision making, and that is the analysis of cumulative impacts. Right? This idea that you kind of you can't put blinders on, and I'm oversimplifying, I know. So Royal, you'll have to rein me in if I go off on a too much of a tangent. But, you know, like this idea that you can't just put blinders on and just look within the square of, well, what is this thing going to do right here, right now? There's this ripple effect, right, of these decisions, especially these large 10,000 acre decisions. So I don't have a question there. I unless you guys want to comment on cumulative impacts and whether it's as awesome as I think it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's no better way to spend a Thursday night than talking about NEPA. This is great, but sadly, the Trump administration has revised CEQ's regulations governing NEPA, and I believe that they have excised consideration of cumulative impact.
Completely? Oh my God, that is
so.
earth-shattering.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not going to comment on that. That's really disturbing. NEPA is still fantastic. Well, so
that's for a whole nother evening.
That's a whole nother call.
Yes.
That is a whole nother call. Oh my gosh. Well, so as I understand it, a number of, if not the majority of, conservation and environmental groups in Florida are submitting comments and activating to ask EPA not to grant this authority to the State Department of Environmental Protection. You know, Royal, can you speak a little bit to why that might be? Why is everybody lining up in opposition? Aside from all the good reasons that we've talked about already, wetlands are important, these federal checks and balances are really important. I mean, any other reasons that you want to share as far as why is everybody opposed to this?
That's a good question, because the Clean Water Act itself contemplates that states can do this, but I think the concern has to do with the motivation. Why does the state want to assume the program? Well, it might want to assume the program perhaps to better protect the resources. That could be one argument. That does not appear to be the case, however, because the state actually has the tools right now to regulate more strictly if it wanted to, either through its own state permit program or by using different tools available in the federal system through, say, water quality certifications, things like that.
Well, because I mean, federal laws are a floor, right? They're not a ceiling. States can always do more.
Exactly. Exactly. So if a state wanted to take over the program to be more protective, that would make good sense. However, states, and there are a lot of states looking at this. I mean, Florida is a test case as well. I mean, that's another reason why I think environmental groups are taking a look at this quite closely, because this could set a precedent for other states. And we do have a well-developed permit program in the state as compared to other states. But the concern here is, okay, so why? Why does the state want this? Well, it's for efficiency. Right? What's efficiency mean? Well, it means you're removing a layer of regulation and you get your permits quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily for environmental purposes.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Amber, anything else you want to share on this before we kind of start? Because the other piece that I want to ask you all about, because we've covered a lot of ground, is kind of what people can do. But before we get there, anything else that you want to share as far as like why is this a bad idea for DEP to take this on?
Yeah, I mean, I think Royal covered quite a few, and we've already talked about quite a few. But you know, one of the things that sticks out to me is the financial aspect. I mean, there are a number of things in order to assume a program that the state has to show EPA in order to get that approval. And you know, one of those things is that they'll be able to run this program, administer this program. And we were very concerned that if they would have the right type of staffing and funding for training and resources going forward before COVID. Mm-hmm. And I think recently, with the current health crisis that we're in, with the basically fiscal free fall that Florida is in, with at least 2.7 billion is the last I heard. It could be more of a shortfall for next fiscal year. It just begs the question of why does the state continue to pursue getting additional burdens, additional responsibilities? It does already have quite a few responsibilities that, some would argue that they're behind on, that they could do a better job on. I know I can think of a few water bodies in my neighborhood that need some more improvements that DEP is directly responsible for now.
Right.
Why take on this additional burden, especially in light of these fiscal concerns? From an environmental perspective, I just don't know how DEP will be able to do more with less. And I think when it comes down to it, we're going to start to see that strain in the decision making.
Right. Well, and on the doing more with less, we've at Florida Conservation Voters, we started actually tracking the total environmental budget. So how much funding is the legislature giving to the Department of Environmental Protection and other environmental agencies every year? And if you look over the last decade, it's not like there's a significant increase. There's been barely keeping up, if even keeping up with like just increased costs over time. So it's not the case, as far as we can see, that DEP has been building resources or building staff or building really the capacity to take on these extra responsibilities. So
yeah, and there's FWC as well, the state wildlife agency that has now been thrown into the mix as well, mm-hmm. which has its own sort of can of worms of issues, but their staff's also going to be relied upon to do big chunks of this program on the wildlife side. And, that's another agency that they already have a lot on their plate, just looking at state listed species. So I don't know how they'll also be able to assist in this, administering this program if they do get approval. Right. So there's a lot of questions.
Right. Lots of questions. So November 2nd, is the deadline coming up. So what's the public, like, how can the public get involved? What's the public process here? I don't know, Royal or Amber, I think you both have been really involved in this. So whoever would like to answer.
So I'll jump in. It's a public comment process. So frequently when an agency is going to be making a decision, whether it might be promulgating a rule or making a decision like this, the agency will seek public comment that the agency then needs to consider. And so interested members of the public, stakeholders, you can submit your comments to the EPA, and the EPA is obliged to consider them. So if you're submitting comments, so what do you want to do? Right. Well, either you want to bolster those parts of the agency action you support, or you're trying to persuade the agency to take a different course from what is proposed. You're also thinking about the building the record for any potential litigation down the road. So public comments can be helpful in that regard. But whatever whatever tack you take, specificity is important. The more specific you can be in your comments, the more helpful it is to the agency, but also more helpful in building that record for judicial review. So if you're thinking about, okay, specifically, what might you comment on could be the staffing levels of DEP.
Right.
It could be on particular species that might be affected. It could be circling back to what's the state's primary responsibility under the Clean Water Act. It's non-point source pollution. It's agricultural runoff. We seem to have a blue-green algae problem here. We have a problem with harmful algal blooms that cause environmental effects, human health impacts, economic impacts. Maybe the state ought to handle that first before it looks to take over a federal program.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's specific, and it's such a zinger. That's not a technical term, obviously.
But individual people, I mean, you've been affected by these algal blooms. You can write in and note that.
Absolutely, absolutely, making it personal.
And
Amber,
I've seen, there were hearings on this, and what I thought was very powerful from some of the citizens who attended where they shared experiences where in their neighborhood and their community, there were developments in wetlands that they didn't agree with, that they thought were problematic, that even perhaps that they directly fought against, where perhaps the Army Corps did a better job than the DEP. There were plenty of those examples, and I thought that was particularly powerful. So certainly those kind of written comments into the docket would I think also be powerful.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know there are a number of organizations that are mobilizing to help people actually submit comments. And I know that at some point during this Facebook live chat, Carson, who's helping manage this behind the scenes, is going to post a link for folks to be able to do that. We do have a question that came in, and it is around, so here, I'm just going to read it. Would it be more effective to dedicate time to changing or challenging this regulation process, or is it more effective to focus on buying and preserving lands? So what do y'all think about, and what do you think about that?
Do I have to choose?
Well, I mean,
no, you don't have to choose.
Yeah, that's where my head went. I was like,
Yeah.
well, they're both probably pretty important.
I mean, I'd love to hear what others here have to say, but just a gut reaction to the question is obviously both are really critical, really important. I think obviously one outlet of preserving lands is going to be, this long-term permanent acquisition into conservation, public acquisition, and that's a worthy goal to support. And on the other hand, we've got some very vulnerable lands that are important too, that don't have a willing seller, that would like to see their lands developed. And that's where, trying to work through on the wetlands regulations comes in to be important.
Yeah.
And we can, whether you're an organization or a citizen, you do have a role in when these agencies go to make decisions at local, state, or federal level about where development should or should not occur.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like it's there's an offensive and there's a defensive, and both are really important. The offensive strategy is, yes, we need to be acquiring these lands to protect them from ever being in harm's way. And then what we're talking about tonight is a defensive strategy where we're making sure that the systems that are in place to protect them from development when they are not yet in public ownership, but still are playing a really important role in the larger environment, that we have a good defense as well. So yeah, no, I appreciate.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, offense, defense, we need them both. You can't. I'm terrible at sports analogy, so I'll stop there. But I don't think you can have like an effective team if you don't have both in most sports. Great. Well, so any other kind of closing thoughts? The deadline is November 2nd. I guess
Monday.
it's Monday, November 2nd. Lot going on next week. Once the public comment period closes on November 2nd, when do you think that we'll see a decision coming out of the US EPA?
So the US EPA, in publishing their request for comments, said that they expected to make a decision by December 17th.
Just in time for the holidays. Perfect. Well, that's why it's all the more important for there to be an outpouring of opposition to this move. The timing's bad, as we've talked about tonight. The agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, is not in a great place to take on this additional responsibility. And most importantly, our wetlands are too important, right? They're just too important to make a rash decision like this, it seems. Well, so I guess those are my closing thoughts, but Royal and then Amber, if y'all want to close us out with any final thoughts you want to share with folks, please do.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this. It's been great. And I mean, what I would like to say is that like hearkening back to what Amber was talking about in terms of the wetlands of Southwest Florida, is I actually like to take my students there on field trips. I mean, back in the day, in the old days when we could travel. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's really a great experience to go someplace like Big Cypress National Preserve and go through a Cypress Dome. I mean, it's really magical to be able to do that. And we're so lucky to live in a place that offers these environmental amenities. And so it's so important that we appreciate what we have and that we protect them using both the offense and the defense. And so I encourage people to engage in the process. Engage in the process in terms of providing public comment, but also engage in the process in terms of voting. Because ultimately, it's the people that we vote for who then appoint the people who run these agencies. So ultimately, that's what we need to do. Yeah.
Well, and the timing is right for that. I mean, we're definitely in full swing in Florida and around the country. And you can, having your voice be heard through your vote. Thank you, Royal, for highlighting that. I think it's incredibly important. Amber, how would you like to close this out?
Yeah. I just want to bring folks' attention to conservancy.org. If you're looking for more information about 404 assumption proposal. I mean, it's such a technical thing, 404 assumption. I mean, I'm glad that Dr. Gardner is here with us so we can get into the ins and outs of the Clean Water Act and what this all means. But what it really comes down to is protecting our wetlands, which are invaluable to us. And there is some more information about this issue on the conservancy.org webpage. And, Florida Conservation Voters, I think, has made it easy to comment through the action alert, right, Aliki?
Yep.
And so this is your opportunity to weigh in. Any citizen, anybody can weigh in. It's not just environmental groups or lawyers or whoever. Everybody can write a comment in, through the EPA's docket. So we've got links to that on our webpage.
Great.
And Florida, we've got so many resources here compared to other places in the United States. I mean, Florida, we're feeling pretty good for being a pretty special place. We have over 130 listed species. We have over 33 first magnitude springs, 11 million acres of wetlands, 1,200 miles of coastline, and let's see, over 27,000 linear miles of rivers and streams. So wetlands and biodiversity is Florida. And so we're counting on everybody to comment into EPA and say, don't fast track destruction of wetlands and don't approve Florida's proposal.
Amen. Yeah, we our moniker is the Sunshine State, but sometimes I think we're kind of the water state. So I really appreciate you both spending time tonight. I think you're right. Talking about NEPA and this stuff is a great way to spend a Thursday night, Will. So thank you both for your time. Thanks for helping to educate conservation voters around the state about this important issue and this important opportunity that they have to get engaged, both by telling US EPA, don't turn this program over to the State Department of Environmental Protection, number one. And number two, after you tell EPA that, make sure that you cast your vote by next Tuesday, because it is election day. And I wouldn't be representing Florida conservation voters well if I didn't remind everybody that voting is happening tomorrow and on Saturday everywhere in the state. And in many counties, depending on where you live, you may even be able to go and early vote on Sunday. So there's still lots of time. If you haven't dropped off your ballot or gone to vote, there's still plenty of time to do that. Thank you both for being here tonight. We've got the Conservancy, well, not the Conservancy, conservancy.org shared in the Facebook stream. So folks can definitely get some more information there. And again, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.